For this week's video, I want to release another layout design. Here is the site available. It is basically an L-shaped area with a curved end, and in its maximum dimensions, it's around 17 feet north to south by 18.5 feet east to west, although the main area is only about 8 foot 8 inches wide, and then there's this narrow annex down in the southeast corner. The site is bounded by walls on 2.5 sides, with the basement stairs in this location, and the red line is basically a political boundary. It's the maximum extent of the space that the client was able to negotiate with his wife. There is one support column in this location, and the end of the layout is designed to be built under a semicircular bar top, and then we have to leave room for a liquor cabinet somewhere in the area behind the bar. I don't recall what the size was, but this is it drawn to scale. Now, if this was an N scale or even an HO scale layout, it would have been a reasonable space to work with. But this client works in O scale, and this really is not a lot of space for O scale. It is 3-rail. Now, I don't normally accept a lot of 3-rail layout designs. I will only take them on if the client is interested in leaving space for some decent scenery. I tend to pass on those layouts where all the client wants to do is cram in as many loops as possible. Anyway, the client wanted to have a double track oval passing through several different types of scenery, and a staging area in this corner of the room which he wanted to be disguised as some form of legitimate yard. After several false starts, here is the plan that I drew. We can see we have the double track oval. He wanted to use as big a curves as possible because he does have some big locomotives and some full-length passenger cars. Initially, he asked if we could have another loop above the main level that would make use of the south alcove. Obviously, this has to be a much sharper radius curve because it's only 63 inches wide. So he's not able to use 072 curves on this end. Now, putting the extra loop above the main level really wasn't going to work because it would have been impossible to find locations for bridge piers. And connecting the two levels with the grade would have just taken up way too much space. But he said he was okay with having it completely separated and much of it in tunnel. So with that in mind, I drew it in, and I was able to get a fair bit of it visible. Now, this yellow wall on the north backs onto his laundry, and the plan here is to mount a display cabinet on it for all his extra locomotives, and then to build drawers underneath the benchwork in this location to store extra cars. At first, I put in a hidden staging track along the east wall on the lower level. I later changed that. I found a better location for staging tracks on the lower level. It's a bit difficult to see it in this plan. Let me show you another version of it. Here I've put a masking level in so that we don't see the hidden track, and we can see more about what the yard is doing. Now, if you notice on the previous plan, I originally had one additional staging track in this location, but he wanted to put an engine shed, and to do that we needed to eliminate one track because engine house tracks are generally spaced further, and we need space for the walls as well. Now, to visually expand this yard, I suggested putting a mirror along part of the south wall so that the yard will, at least visually, be twice as big and look like a through yard rather than a stub yard. You won't get any more cars in it, but it will really open up the room when it comes to photograph it. Now, as you can see, I was able to include a few industries to allow his local trains to do some work. We have 2 industries and a team track on the upper level, and 2 industries on the lower level, one of which is just going to be a driveway alongside the aisle, representing an industry which is fully in the aisle. And I guess the coal tower could be considered an industry as well. There's an extra spur there where you can park a coal hopper. And as I mentioned, it's not meant to be a complete yard, but he did wanted it to look like some semblance of an engine terminal with a yard behind it. And he has a 6-car passenger train, so I've made the rear track a passenger track. It may look as though it takes away the space of one additional track, but it would have been difficult to find a location for the turnout without excessively shortening the rear tracks. Now he wanted to use Atlas track components, and in most cases you'll see I've used their straight number 5 turnouts. I did use a few 072 turnouts where the curve continues right through the frog, but not where I have to use reverse curves. All the reverse curve situations are straight number 5s. Of course, there simply wasn't room for their number 7s. Now also, none of the mainline curves are uniform. You may notice that I've used sections of much larger radius curve at the ends to act as a sort of pseudo easement. Atlas makes curves up to 108-inch diameter, so I've used sections of those at the ends of all the mainline curves, even though the rest of the curve is 072 on the inside and 081 on the outside. I spread them slightly more to allow for end overhang of these big locomotives, and the way to do that is just to add very short straight sections at the two ends and in the middle. They're not long enough to really notice, but they just give these big locomotives a little bit of extra elbow room. Here is a detail of the low-level loop. You can see that I've got two fairly long staging tracks along the north wall, and note that both industry spurs face the same way, so a local freight running counterclockwise around the loop can switch both of them alternately. So he has staging for two trains. You can have a wave freight set up to go counterclockwise and a through freight set up to go the other way. Most of the hidden curves on this level are 054. Clearly that's the largest that was going to fit here, although I did manage to use 063 at this end and even larger on this curve. I don't actually remember what it was. Anyway, at this point the layout was taking shape quite nicely. I did make some adjustments to the lower deck. Firstly, I stretched this loop so the track at this location was closer to the benchwork edge and therefore further from the upper deck to give more room for the industry in the middle. And I realigned this curve slightly to get the entrance to the staging tracks behind the backdrop for the desert scene, because the idea was to put a bridge in this location and wanted the extra depth. Since this area is going to have a bar over the top of it, we wanted to keep the benchwork fairly simple, and what works is to build it as a solid deck with the low-level loop directly on the deck and the tracks above it around the front scene 8 inches higher on risers, which allows the scenery to extend below track level in the location where it's going to be most noticeable. Here is the finished design. As we can see, we have several different kinds of scenery. He specifically asked for a desert scene, and we talked about the red rocks of Sedona in Arizona. So that's what I've represented under the bar around the semicircle. And in the southwest corner, we're going to have a canyon over a dry wash. And I suggested building the tunnels, or at least one of them, as a natural rock cut instead of having cast concrete tunnel portals, or just to do one each way, just for variety. And on the inside scene, we have a much smaller snow scene, which he wanted to try his hand at. And of course, since this is going to be experimental, we wanted to keep this fairly small. And with the backdrop curving around the middle between these two scenes, we end up with the perfect support for the bar top. He also mentioned he wanted a fall scene with fall colors, and we decided to put that down the middle of the room where there's plenty of space for it. It's actually divided into two by the walkway, which allows access to behind the bar. That's crossed by a couple of truss bridges, and the plan is to have them hinge up out of the way when not in use. I've transitioned from the fall to the summer at the end because he didn't want the whole thing to represent fall. He wanted more variation than that. Also in this bottom corner, I showed a small stream with a stone arch bridge over it, just to give him the opportunity to try his hand at making a water scene. And also it allows for a different kind of bridge. Where we have the support column, I drew an industry which could be several stories tall at this point, thus hiding the support column right up to backdrop height. The other industry on the peninsula has a driveway crossing the track on a grade crossing, so he can try his hand at one of those. I've also shown the industry in the corner having a variety of chemical storage tanks outside, because the tall cylindrical tanks adds an interesting shape to the otherwise rectangular structures. Along the back wall, at some point it will transition from backdrop flats to a tree line, And I've suggested retaining walls as well, so we don't need a lot of vertical rock cuts. Although there is still plenty of opportunity in this area for him to try his hand at a natural rock cut. Initially, this spur in this location, the bottom of the stairs, was intended to be a team track, but it's a good opportunity to build an open front structure with a full interior, and it'd be a shame to waste that opportunity. The low-level spur along the north wall is probably a better location for a team track, since it is a simple driveway representing any kind of aisle side industry. Anyway, this plan is fairly simple. It's a lot less than what I am accustomed to doing. That's because in O-scale it represents a pretty tight space. But this is not intended to be the client's lifetime layout. It's mainly a test bed to allow him to experiment with all the phases of layout construction and building different kinds of scenery. And we've agreed that it does just that for him. It should take him long enough to build it that he can get a sense of accomplishment when it's done. And we're both hoping that it will look nice enough in the corner of his basement family room. And then after a few years, he expects to be ready to start again with a much larger railroad. So I'm just going to wind up this video at this point, and I'm going to say goodbye for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.